anyways, thank you all for coming tonight. I'm very, very excited for this conversation, and for all of us that we have here in terms of who's attending. This is something that a lot of us end up being involved with, and a lot of us are passionate about opera. It's such a storied, traditional art form. It is, I mean, there's constantly reinventing itself, and it's constant reaction to the times that we have and the redefinitions of music and cultures and identities. And in many ways, I think many of us have known opera from a way in which it's been classical operas and pieces have been reinterpreted and reimagined. And for a lot of artists, it is kind of their stamp and their identity is how do you reimagine a classic form, a classic story. But that's the great thing about opera, is that it has so much capacity and so many ways in which it can be reinvented really from the ground up and from the music itself. And there are so many incredible composers and librettists and directors and designers and dramaturgs and producers who are doing that work. And also it feels like it's work that should be done because it is speaking about identities and voices that are here now. I mean, they've always been, but also are very much part of the zeitgeist and part of what we're talking about now. And so that felt like, why don't we gather together a group of amazing artists who are doing exactly that and begin having those discussions really and seeing where they lead. So luckily enough, it's not just me kind of handling all of this. It is also Noelle Deutsch from Opera America is coming in so graciously to moderate this conversation. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hand it off to her.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much to Wingspace for having me. Really appreciate getting to be a part of this great conversation with this great panel. I do want to give the panelists the opportunity to introduce themselves in their own words. So just starting alphabetically, I'll throw it first to Jasmine, and then you can pass it on to the next person when you're finished.
Okay, I'm Jasmine Barnes. I'm a composer, a singer. Let's see, I am currently a resident artist for American Lyric Theater in New York City. I live, though, in Dallas, Texas, and I'm from Baltimore, Maryland originally. I never said that, but yeah, a little bit about me. I love all forms of music. It's interesting that I would decide to go into such a specific genre. But in the same token, I believe that all genres have a space and relativity into each other. And so that's really why I wanted to insert myself into opera and into classical music. And so I'm rambling, so I'm gonna pass it. I'm gonna pass it to Priti.
Thanks, Jasmine. My name is Priti Gandhi. Very good to be here with you all. I am the artistic director of Portland Opera. I was also an opera singer for over 20 years, singing in houses all over the world. And so many people here I have the joy of calling good friends and colleagues. I moved from performance into administration because I wanted to see what I could do to make it a better space for artists. I wanted to know, how could I lift artists up to know that they were more empowered than they thought when they were in the singing career. And that is my North Star, and it always has been. And I'm so happy to be in a position to finally affect some change in that respect. I was born in Bombay, India. I grew up in Southern California, and opera was never, ever on the radar in terms of my culture or my upbringing. So joining opera was a huge accident, and I'm so glad that I did that. Really looking forward to this conversation. I will pop it over to Vita.
Thank you, Priti. My name is Vita Tzykun. I am from Ukraine. I'm born and raised in Ukraine. Then later we emigrated Soviet Union to Israel. So I lived there for 12 years. And then I came to the States to do my master's degree in production design for stage and film. And I've been living here for about 2 decades now. For the past decade, I've been primarily designing sets and costumes for opera. I grew up in a musical family. My grandmother and mom worked as accompanists to the ballet corps at the Odessa Opera House, which is one of the most beautiful opera houses in Eastern Europe. I grew up dancing ballet there. So actually going to see opera and seeing ballet, I must have been doing that since I was a toddler, because mom would bring me to work. And so having that music in my background is just part of my DNA. However, I'm extremely passionate about new work and designing for new work. And in the past decade, actually before this conversation, I started calculating how many world premieres I designed, because I really love collaborating with living artists, composers, writers. I designed, just in the past decade, I designed 9 world premieres, 1 European premiere and 1 Russian premiere. It's really made me actually very happy to see that so much new work is being produced, primarily in the United States, actually. And the work is so strong and so engaging. And I consider myself extremely fortunate to take part in this movement, and excited to talk about all of it today with you all. So I'm gonna pass it on to Noelle.
Hi, yes, thank you. I realized before in my excitement to toss it over to the panel that I did not actually say who I am and what I do. My name is Noelle Deutsch. I'm an arts administrator at Opera America, and I am a former freelance stage manager. So I studied theater design. It kind of came into the opera world through actually my experience with theater and dance. And I just loved the way that opera combined many art forms that I was already a huge fan of. So it's been a really great adventure, and I'm very happy to be here. I'm going to throw it over to Nehemiah to introduce themselves.
Thanks. Hi, friends. I'm Nehemiah Rolle. My pronouns are they, them. I'm based in Queens, New York, but I grew up in West Palm Beach, Florida, Atlanta, Georgia, Cleveland, Ohio, Winston-Salem, North Carolina, and now here in New York, just really making my way up and up. By day, I'm on the curation team at TED Conferences, the company that makes TED Talks. And then by night and on weekends, I am a arts and culture performance curator, a culture critic, and drag performer. And I kind of come to the world of opera also by accident in many ways. My performance background is in kind of an intersection of musical theater, color guard, and drag. And I came to opera through a connection with City Lyric Opera, which is a company here based in New York that is great, perfect, okay. I don't have to necessarily do the spiel, but this company really opened up my eyes to what opera could be. And as someone that always saw opera as this sort of archaic art form that was still trying to find its relevance in the modern landscape, I grew to appreciate both its traditions as well as how that allows it to do sustainable transgressive work. So I'm really interested in trying to figure out how do we surface the ideas behind opera, interpret them in a modern lens, and also allow our audiences to tell us what resonates, not just tell them what resonates.
And Lila, I think we haven't heard you yet. So if you want to go ahead and introduce yourself as well.
Sure. Yeah, I'm Lila, and I'm a librettist and a producer. I was also an opera singer for 10 years. And after 10 years of only playing boys or getting killed, I got a bit cross with the roles that were available. And I used some of my training. I'd also worked in children's publishing as an editor for a couple of years. I was like, I'm gonna fix some of these stories so we're not all suicidal after rehearsal. Yay! So that was kind of my pathway to being a librettist. And yeah, so it's kind of always been about the story. I actually trained as a historian, and that was very much for me about like, if culture is the output, then let me understand what is happening, so then I can understand the culture contextually. So that always informs my practice. I also have a secondary practice in museum activation and kind of heritage institution activation. So I try and find the stories that are already kind of embedded and make them live as well. Let's see, I'm a hybrid baby. I grew up between the States and the UK. And so my career has been in both of those places. And I was invited back to the States by ALT as a resident artist several years ago, like Jasmine. I had a lovely time. And then during the pandemic, I was invited back to be their managing director for a year to manage them through a transition. And now, because I'm really fortunate to be writing lots of amazing new operas, I've stepped back and I'm still doing partnerships and promotions part-time for them, because I'm also a new mom and I have a 5-month-old. So that's me. And I'm super excited to be here and chat to you all, because we just moved to Toronto and I don't know anyone here. So hello, tribe of lovely creatives. I miss you all.
Awesome. Thank you so much, all of you, for sharing a little bit about yourselves. And I'm interested to hear your thoughts as we go on. I wanted to start with one question. And what is the most unique thing you're seeing happening in the opera world right now from your perspective? You each have such unique perspectives on the industry, doing what you do. So I'd love to hear something unique that you're seeing happening right now. And anyone can go ahead and start with that if you're super excited about it.
Go ahead.
I'll start. I was just gonna say, I recently got to see the production of Lucia at the Met. And one thing I really actually enjoyed about it, although some people had their own opinions, I personally thought that the use of cinematography within, I'm sorry if I'm spoiling it for anyone, but the use of cinematography within the live stage space, I thought was inventive, and something that actually, I think more of the American public views theater and cinematography much more than obviously seeing live music, right? And so to bring that into the space, I think created another world for new viewers, and not in the sense of just the responsibility that we have as a genre to bring those who were excluded, including people of my own culture, excluded from the art form. Not just that as a responsibility, but even those who want to keep opera in the space of what it's always been, right? So it's informing, I believe, more than those who, what we would consider unaware, because unawareness does not mean, how do I say it? Unawareness doesn't mean knowledge. I'm trying to think of the way of how I'm lack of knowledge or whatever the case. Sorry to not figure out what words I want to say, but I just wanted to start. I'm sorry, Vita, you wanted to say something. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Oh, no, well, actually, it's really great that you brought this point about usage of cinematography in opera, you know, because some people see it as this big new innovation of right now, which in fact, it's not true, because opera in its roots, if we think about the creation of opera many hundreds of years ago, it was the most technologically advanced art form, period. You know, it was the most technologically advanced art form that combined the most cutting edge scenography, the most advanced vocalizations, music, lighting, everything together. There was no other art form on the planet that combined that many elements into one thing that was performed live. It just didn't exist. And so somehow in the 20th century, this all degraded much. And the art form became extremely formulaic. And then after that, for decades, people were attempting to kind of preserve it with like these cotton gloves, you know, very careful, like museum work, right? That you don't want to disturb, And actually, you know, I found this quote the other day, which I'm just going to read to you because I find it absolutely perfect, spot on in regards to what we're talking about. Mahler actually said, tradition is not to preserve the ashes, but to pass on the flame. You know, and I think that what we need to do with opera is not to preserve the ashes, but to remember the ethos of opera. to be the most all-encompassing and rich art form that encompasses all the cutting-edge technology, anything that is available to us as storytellers, and creating the most spectacular, rich event that can wow our audiences. I think that's the zeitgeist. And so that's why, you know, to your point, Jasmine, you know, people who say, oh my God, they're using cinema and opera, you know, they're being so upset about it. It's actually hilarious because this is the most traditional thing you can do. You know, using all this technology is the most traditional thing you can do with opera. So that's my 2 cents.
I mean, you are absolutely correct, of course, and I feel like everyone that's in this room is kind of very much aware of that tradition and very much. But I mean, the fact is that we haven't actually acted like that. So it's very exciting to think, imagine if opera conceived of itself that way, right, as this innovation space. That we imagined ourselves as the cutting edge, because as individual practitioners, I feel like a lot of us do feel like that. Like, yes, I am interested in the newest thing, the most exciting thing, this hybrid of like, yes, I'm going to work with that person that's working in gaming, and I'm going to work with that person that's, you know, whatever. But this, I think, the self-perception of the industry is as much that, as well as audiences. So that's an interesting thing that I think hopefully everyone in this room can change. Which leads me to my next point, which is to say this has nothing to do with what you just said, except that the thing that I'm most excited by, and I don't know if it's unique, so this might be a misdirect, in which case ignore me, but one of the things that I'm really excited by is I'm seeing individual companies really center and build programming out from individual artists that inspire them, and using the networks of each artist exactly actually like Wingspace is functioning, and saying, you know, Jasmine knows Josh and she knows Lila, and she, or me, you know, Anna knows Lila and whatever. And so let's bring in the ecosystem of a particular artist that we feel passionate about, and then trust the artist to program and curate, and then all these little ecosystems build ecosystems. And rather than the institution, I mean, I know like Portland has been doing that with Damien Jeter, right? That's a classic example, and it's working really well. It's amazing what happens when you listen to artists. So I'm really excited about that, because when I see companies and producers like trusting, letting go of control, and handing over the power to creatives and trusting their networks and their imaginations, then you get really exciting programming, and you get really cutting edge programming. You get collaborations that would take the institution much longer, because big institutions are like steering battleships, right? They take time to turn. So if you let this little person, one person go, okay, here's all my stuff, then it happens really fast. And that's really exciting. And that hasn't been happening before, more recently in opera. And that is something that I'm starting to see as well in chamber programming as well, and smaller festivals, and in some of the major institutions. So I hope that people pay attention to that, because individuals that are trusted, that have good instincts, can move the dial so quickly. And that is wonderful, because it's less chat and more change.
I'd love to take off on what Lila has talked about, because there's something else that just came to mind. I was going to say something completely different, but Lila, thank you for the shout out, first of all. And yes, Damien is helping us to reach out into the community in ways that we didn't even imagine. So it's just fantastic. But to your point about big companies being battleships and it takes time to turn, one unique thing that I'm seeing, because I've always been associated with bigger companies, even as a singer, it's so interesting, because bigger companies do have, it is much more difficult for bigger companies to do this shift and change the way that we are talking about, because of various challenges. There are larger subscribers, there are big houses to fill, there are union contracts to fill. There are so many ways in which we have to make conversations to make it okay for every one of those corners to make those changes. Otherwise, it drastically decreases or changes our revenue, our budget, our expenses. such boring things to talk about, and yet it's so important. So the thing that I see happening that's really exciting is that larger companies are now starting to make associations with smaller, more experimental companies, so that we can somehow start to bridge that gap in a way which is less of a challenge for us, but allows us to start welcoming in new creators in a whole new way, and to use them as these curation labs that we can come in and experiment with and see, how does this land with our community? What kind of cultivation can we get here that we can start to excite people about? And that's the way that we need to start to get our own audiences to trust us moving forward, so that we can expand the repertoire, and that it's not just 5 shows of traditional repertoire for the larger regional companies or the big companies, but we're also going to be able to add some of this in, because now they're starting to get cultivated in a way which hopefully gets people interested and gets them growing into the taste of what this all means. I hope that all made sense, because that isn't actually what I was going to say.
That complete sense, and something that made me think of when we're talking about institutions and how they move and institutional choreography is really, it's less about decentering the institution, but more so right-sizing power in the creative and artistic ecosystem. In particular, doing so in a way that both, I think, creatively and also programmatically working to tell stories that actually do connect with your audiences, and also are involving them in different ways and creating or co-creating a program with and for your community in some ways. And then also thinking about where those productions and that programming is taking place. So one thing that I'm super excited about with City Lyric Opera's current season is that they're doing not only what I think is a very fantastic production inspired by Alice in Wonderland, and we can talk about that, but more so where they're doing it. And they're doing it in this gallery space that by day is open to the public for them to explore the narrative of Alice in Wonderland through video and through these other elements. And then by night is where the production takes place. And so it's kind of a wraparound program, not happening in dark halls, but in something embedded in a community that allows for the story to not only live there, but also the takeaways to live beyond where it's currently being constrained.
Yeah, I love that point, because actually one of the things that are unique that I wanted to bring up, that as a designer, I started seeing more and more opera companies venturing out of the proscenium theater and into site-specific work, which is very exciting. You know, like Atlanta Opera, actually because of COVID, they started performing in this large circus tent and created an extremely successful season. You know, Detroit Opera created a production in the parking lot. You know, the industry created productions in cars, where cars were moving through LA and stopping and picking up people, and, you know, I mean, et cetera, et cetera. Obviously, opera is happening in VR that all came out during the pandemic. And so exploring space, exploring various spaces, I think makes it much more accessible to various communities. And I think it spikes curiosity, because I think that there is a certain hesitation, especially from the younger audiences, to kind of enter the traditional opera house. Somehow they think they need to dress up, and somehow they think that there needs to be this code of behavior, or, you know, I don't know what to do or what to wear, or, you know, what purse to take. And in fact, it has nothing to do with consuming the art form, you know? And I feel like if you're saying that, oh, well, this is going to be in a gallery, or this is going to be in the parking garage or in the tent, you know, people drop this hesitation and fear and say, oh, okay, well, I'm just going to go and experience the art. So it's very cool that it's happening.
It's super interesting though, because it also demands different things of the institutions, right? Like Anna and I met working on immersive opera in London like several years ago, and we've done a bunch of them, from like a 30-acre tropical garden all the way to like the Square Mile in London. And, you know, you're negotiating permits, like, you know, and noise control and different hours and church bells and like all this craziness, you know, and your process itself, the process itself by which the piece is made, has to be so much more responsive and flexible. And so it also demands very different things, not just of the artists, but of the institutions and the rehearsal process and all of those things. So it's exciting, but it does demand different things. And there's always going to be, I feel like, a lag as we explore, right, what is kind of possible and necessary. There's always that kind of stretch as everyone figures it out and you know, so it's exciting and also kind of the Wild West. But obviously, like, theatre's been doing it for ages, and so we'll figure it out. It's great. It does also change if you think about the process that's required to put on a new opera. I guess the thing that is both amazing and also heartbreaking about it in terms of how long it takes you to make it is that those site-specific works tend to only live once. And so that is both beautiful and painful. Like, certainly the first 15 operas I wrote were for site-specific spaces, and they would be bonkers in any other place. So you're sort of, it's also a different approach to the permanency of the art form, which is sort of interesting. I don't know.
Absolutely. And this kind of touches on one of the questions that I wanted to ask, which is that in the standard rep, there are certain conventions that define the art form. And Vita, your original point touched on this a lot, like about preserving the way that things have always been done. And one example is of that, and Lila, you spoke a little bit about this as well, is how a voice type can influence how you're cast. It can influence your character type. And so what is New Opera doing to break some of these conventions, either from a casting perspective or a design perspective? What can New Opera do to help kind of shatter some of these old conventions that are still very much preserved in a lot of cases?
I'd love to start. So when you think about the word classical, right? The root of it being classic, and classic is by definition judged over a period of time of something that's the highest quality and like outstanding of its kind, right? So it already formed from this elitist perspective. And so when you have people trying to integrate themselves within a space that already views themselves as the best, it's hard to change it, right? So when we have these thoughts about casting, for instance, we've had the battle, we've had the struggle with, being represented correctly, not just by the story, but also just in how people are cast and who is cast in these specific spaces, right? And how works are written as well to reflect that. We have there is this structure and standard that already exists within opera that every creator almost feels obligated to conform into, at risk of like not being accepted if you don't, basically. And it's kind of like a gun to the head kind of situation, often it feels. And I personally can say that because, I would definitely be considered someone that did not come from the world of opera. I'm not someone who spent most of my life within it, but the first art form I started singing was opera, and I wasn't an adult. I wasn't a child when I began, I was an adult. And so my entrance into the world was as a performer. My first opera I ever saw, I was on the stage, and that's technically not seeing it in a way. Creating roles that make sure that there's inclusivity, I believe, will bring and create more spaces for the companies to have these opportunities. Like Lila was saying earlier about how, I'm sorry, I'm thinking, I'm not a good talker, but she was saying how the companies are commissioning artists for like a one-time performance, basically, right? But they'll willingly and more often do an adaptation of an older opera to with the mindset of preservation still in a way. I think it would be interesting to see companies want to regularly perform new operas. And that, don't get me wrong, there are quite a few companies that are doing so, but I think the benefit in doing that would not only create work for those who are into the space, but also create more of opportunities for inclusivity, more opportunities for roles that could be created for different voice types that can fit into a different space. Like a teenager could be a bass, that's fine. A grandmother could be a soprano, and that's fine. A lyric soprano, and that's totally fine. It just depends on what kind of character we're creating for these roles and these voice types. Okay, I'm done. I'll pass it on.
I can't see everyone's face at the same time, so I've talked a lot. So if there's someone that wanted to say something before I talk again, then I will wait for someone else to say something, but because I can't see all of you. But otherwise I'll jump in because I'm super excited about this topic.
Yeah, go ahead, Lila.
Okay. So I guess I would say that I don't think that opera currently is necessarily setting out with that intention to break those conventions. But kind of riffing on what Jasmine was saying, I think that as the group of composers and the group of librettists who are being commissioned to tell stories expands out of a very limited group of people, then those composers and those librettists express both stories and musical idioms that require different types of singing, different vocalization, different types of people that are expressed musically differently. And so as soon as that starts to happen, I think you're already seeing it. You're seeing new techniques, new characters that don't fit all of those kind of standard classical types. So I think we'll see the standard conventions shifting or maybe expanding the more that the storytellers, musical and textual, expand. That said, I also think that it's not necessary. I'm terrible for speaking in like half sentences and caveating, so please forgive me. Those types, obviously, in my experience, could be incredibly restrictive and feel sometimes like abusive. Like you have to wonder what happens to a soprano who's always being killed. Like, because we know that the body can't tell the difference often between things that we're acting like systemically and things that are actually happening to us. So like that's a research interest of mine. And I've actually developed a whole piece called Opera Murder Club, which is about examining all the dead women from their perspective. But that's another thing. So yes, those types can be destructive and oppressive, especially if we feel we don't fit into them. They don't give us room to expand. But at the same time, those types come from dramatic types within the tradition of like the Commedia dell'arte or whatever. And what can be super exciting is to knowingly play with, against, into, around them. I've certainly had conversations with friends of mine who love playing the type, and then just by being who they are expanding the notion of what the type can be. So that's a revolution in itself. For me, the very first opera I ever wrote was at the Guildhall, and I was working with 12 young singers who were like, it was like having a fleet of Ferraris. It was amazing. And I think probably because it was Guildhall, I was working with a lot of actors as well. And what they do with actors in their first year of drama school is they deliberately cast them against type to expand what they feel like their casting type. And so I tried that out in my very first opera. I cast the mezzo as the not Carmen, but like sexy, like kind of the girl who always, like me, had to play the boy, got to be like the sexy love interest, and like the beautiful soprano was like actually kind of didn't get the whole, she got to be kind of nasty. And like, it was great. Everyone was going against. And the buy-in from the singing actors was amazing because they were like, oh, this feels really good. I'm dancing, it's awesome. But I think like, I want us to all do it with awareness, because the other thing that opera does so well and so successfully is to layer meaning. So we use those types, the archetypes, to layer intensity of meaning into the space, right? And so they're still useful. We don't have to throw them all away. We just have to manipulate them consciously, expand them, play with them, maybe destroy them if we want to when they're not useful. But I kind of I love them and hate them. So yeah, I would be sad if we weren't aware of them, because I think the most exciting stuff is when you're conscious and playing.
I would love to jump in here. Like Lila, I have so much to say about this topic. So as a singer for many years, first I'll just start from personal experience, was I started off as a coloratura mezzo, and then I moved into lyric soprano. However, the truth of the matter is I was truly a Zwischenfach for most of that time. And so often what I found was that if I had the breadth of repertoire that I could sing and did well on my resume, people looked at me like I was mad. So I eventually learned that I had to have two resumes coming into auditions. I had to have a mezzo resume and I had to have a soprano resume. And I left off everything that would confuse people who couldn't think outside the box on those resumes so that people would see me clearly. We had to do the work to make people imagine clearly. And so the thing that I have taken from that experience as a singer and coming into now the administrator role is now when I'm watching a singer, we just did New York auditions in December. I try to think, what does this artist bring to the role that I feel is going to serve this role in this production for the purposes that I would like. So in this upcoming season in Portland, there are two roles I specifically cast that are actually not in that Fach, because I love those artists so much and I knew that they would bring something to that role that I really wanted to show. But of course, when you're doing that, you have to make sure that this is a range and tessitura that they can still handle. So you talk to them honestly. And of course, the first thing a singer is going to say is it's very hard to turn down work. They're going to say, I can do it. So you really have to have an honest conversation, and there's a lot of trust involved in saying, now, wait a minute, I will think of you, but please look at this role and really tell me, can you do this in a way which is not going to hurt your voice, but you have something I want to bring to this role. So that's the first thing I'd like to say. The other thing I'd like to say, which is so interesting, is because now that we're doing this with new work, new opera, people thinking and expanding in different ways, I see it bleeding backwards into the traditional repertoire, which is also exciting. For instance, Stephanie Blythe just recently tackling the tenor role of Don Jose in Chicago. I mean, super exciting. That's just really, really interesting to see an artist who says, well, I want to play with that role, and no one can tell me that I can't. And I see that happening a lot, gender flipping roles now, even with traditional companies, to bring a new quality into a role, not just with voice, but with artist, and also to upend our expectation of what that role is when you gender flip. There are so many ways in which I feel like we are starting to work on this. And I love this question because it is something that absolutely pigeonholed me and was very frustrating in the career of a singer. And I look at what's happening now and I wish, I wish this had been happening when I was coming up in the field, because I would be so excited by the possibilities that are being given to singers now to think truly expansive in terms of what their abilities are.
Several things about that I love. First of all, one of which I think really resonates with me is this idea of the space that we're in is requiring every person within the sort of creative and artistic ecosystem to critically reflect on their role, first of all, within a production, but then also outside the production. How are we going to carry, let's say, so I had the great fortune of being a dramaturge on City Lyric Opera's production of Three Penny Opera that we did over Zoom. And on one hand, I was a little bit afraid because I just didn't want this to be a shiny production on Zoom. I didn't want there to be a lack of critical thought about why are we choosing X, Y, Z choice beyond just needing to sell tickets, beyond just needing to do something to stay alive, frankly, during the height of quarantine in New York, where folks weren't able to perform in person, so on and so forth. But we had a fantastic director who created space for us to take time to think about what those intentions are. And something that I'm thinking about is, okay, how do we, one, shift the work in the conversation from it happening when you are fresh out of college, so fresh out of conservatory? How do we also trace these conversations, trace the training, trace the trauma back in some ways, back to certain conservatory and schooling environments in which you are not only taught what the archetypes are, but you are also taught your cultural, political, and musical relationship to and proximity to that archetype. And I'm just a little bit worried that sometimes when we're doing this kind of work, that these institutions and schools that have the long view by virtue of having that long financial foundation are able to just sort of say, okay, great, you can have that, and watch you sort of peter out as we continue to turn out the same, not quite the same kind of singers, but different forms of the same kind of trauma and same kind of limited thinking about one's training, either musically or production-wise, so on and so forth. So just thinking about ways that we can have these conversations in productions, but also figure out how do we locate them in institutions who should also be a part of this conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think that it's so amazing that these conversations are happening now when we see the biggest transition in audience. I don't know if I can say audience type in the history of our culture, because if you think about at the moment, the vast majority, if I were to really generalize, the vast majority of people in their 70s are very different from the vast majority of people in their 20s. They consume completely different media. They consume it in completely different ways. Their frame of references are completely different. And so I think what's really challenging for large institutions, like what Priti was talking about, is that large institutions must cater to a really wide variety of audience because they have to fill enormous holes in order to sustain themselves financially. Because unfortunately in America, operas is funded largely by philanthropy. It means that it's largely paid for by rich people, which means it's largely being paid for by rich older people who had the time to amass that wealth, which then leads to certain programming. Because if you do not do that programming, these people will simply not donate to your opera house, which means your opera house will close and not be able to provide any opportunities to anybody whatsoever. And so the reason why large American opera houses absolutely must continue to perform traditional repertoire is that it's their only way to remain open and sustain presence and afford to invite other younger artists to create new work, etc. If they don't do the traditional repertoire, they will simply close. Because unlike in Europe, or in Russia, or in many other countries in China, where the arts are largely funded by the government, here it's largely funded by philanthropy. And so I'm taking it seemingly a bit away from the topic. However, it is so connected. It is so, the budgetary structure of this whole situation is dictating to us all how we operate. That's why the smaller companies are very much able to do experimental work, because they only have to fill a hall of 50 people, 100 people, 500 people. And there can be totally 500 people who are all between the ages of 20 and 35, who all have the same frame of reference and are extremely open-minded and want to see great new work. But then you have to be on a smaller scale. I think that's the primary reason why large opera companies in the United States shift so much slower, and they just have much more different restrictions than the smaller ones.
Can I jump on that very hot button? Okay. The fact to me that the opera and just classical music in general is just so heavily based on donor money. I'm like, what else can I say? Money, right? What it does, as much as we're all very grateful for the generosity of donors, what it does is it removes the agency from the artist. It removes the agency from the organization. The autonomy that we have within our art form, this is what we chose to do because of our creativity levels within ourselves. And so to be limited by someone who has power because of money, oh man, we already live in such a capitalist society, but to enter into an art form that perpetuates the very existence of the ugliest part of the country, in my opinion, because it's I don't know, we artists live on the edge every day, and the risk and thought in their head that I will not have this career if. That is always the baseline thought. I will not have this career if I offend a donor, if I offend someone of the organization, if I am not performing the role the way the organization wants me to, or a donor wants me to, if I don't do this opera that the donor said I must do, right? This kind of thought process is almost it's a little it's kind of like captivity a little bit sometimes. And to be a creative and feel that you are forced into this box or that you're forced into this space where you have to do what everyone tells you, where's the autonomy in that? And why has that been such a transformation over time in the history of opera, where opera was not just, I mean, there were plenty of people, royal people, all types of people saying, this is what we must do, or this is what you must do. But the level of creativity and the I guess the freedom to create, I feel over time, especially within the 20th century, kind of pushed itself away from the art form. And upholding this, this older form of the art, I would say, has really been more like a almost gun to the head. I said that before, but I really do mean that, right? This feeling of I can't be the artist that I've chosen to be because of fear. It's such a fear-based society, of a fear-based mechanism within the art form. And I wish that could be something that could change. I wish, like you said, Vita, I really wish that the country would view art as something that's valuable to the entire country, and make arts government funded, so we don't have to, no offense to donors, we love donors, but no offense, so we don't have to do exactly just what donors want us to do. And to that point, there are quite a few wealthy younger people in the world, people in their 30s and 40s, that have quite a bit of money, but they have no need to give to these arts organizations because there is no space for them to give it. Like, why would I give you my money if all you're doing is putting what you want to put on the set? Well, that's the viewpoint from someone that's not in the world. We know what really is happening, but from outside of it, it's like, I would not go. Outside of the world, I'm like, I wouldn't go. I would not go. I wouldn't go. So just that thought.
Jasmine, can I jump in here and just say amen to all of that? I was on a panel a few months ago where someone said, well, what is needed to create true change in opera? And I said, funding models. You have to look at funding models. I mean, if we don't go right to the top of where the money is coming from, that true change really is going to take a very, very long time to happen. Absolutely. So amen to everything you just said. But I also want to give an optimistic view of the fact that all of the smaller experimental companies that are coming now, this is where the true curation labs are happening. And so that is a really exciting thing, because now we are starting to see the bigger companies, the foundations, the grants, they are starting to see the value in that. And there are so many grants and foundations now that are putting into their parameters of application that we want to see more progressive work. We want to see more BIPOC work. And that is now big companies are having to pay attention to that because those funding models are changing. And as somebody, I'm still someone who loves traditional opera, as Vita knows. I adore traditional opera, but I also know that we want to expand. We want to expand the repertoire so we have room for all of it. So I just wanted to say amen to everything that you just said, because so much of that is in there. And of course, the American system versus the European system, there's such a large difference in how we can create this art. And some people may disagree with me or not, but certainly that has been my experience up to this point. And it's really exciting to see how we're all starting to push against those boundaries and change it.
Just to quickly jump in, this is kind of what makes me think, oh, I'm sorry. Well, actually, I'm going to, what I was getting ready to say is this also makes, Lila, what you said so resonant about really performer and creator aftercare, but also throughout the entire development process. Because one thing that I'm so excited about is that smaller companies and smaller collectives can be these incubators of new work. And then also to what degree, and to the detriment of someone's safety, psychological, material, so on and so forth, to where we are celebrating their life because they died early because of something that they've gone through, not necessarily based on a production, but it's not necessarily always that linear, but just to kind of bring us in that space for the example of aftercare is so important because we don't create in vacuums, we don't perform in vacuums. And I just do not want to see someone give so much to a movement happening in opera, only for opera not to give them anything back, both the production and the art form.
I think that's so real, what you just said. And I can't tell you how many, well, we all know so many burned out people who've fallen out of opera for that exact reason. And that's really real. to talk about the economics, because the economics is real. I will say this. I started my opera career in the UK, which is funded on Arts Council models. And I guess I would say that that is also not, that is not a perfect world either. One of the best lectures about art making that I got was from a conductor who said, if a nurse and a fireman and a road sweeper are paying taxes for you to make your art, what art are you going to make? So your responsibility as an artist for what you're saying, if those people are paying you, is very different. And that was like a, for me, certainly, and maybe want to do like a bloody good job, firstly. So that's kind of like, that's the best case scenario in some ways, right? That you have this deep, deep sense of responsibility to your audience. And people talk about that in kind of an arty-farty way, but like when you get down to the brass tacks of it, that's like, oh, my nurse needs, like, that nurse needs to pay her childminder so she can work a double shift, and she's paying me. So like, this better need to be said, you know? So that's like the good thing. The downside of that is that those institutions all have their rubrics of success, and the Arts Council funding model, by way of example, is not interested in my experience, in getting to the maximum number of people necessarily. So for example, they don't support an idea, they'll support edgy over getting it to lots of people. So it doesn't encourage innovation, it doesn't encourage partnership, it's very like, well, we've given you money to do this one thing with this one particular audience, and you cannot use it any other way. And so it discourages companies from collaborating and from saying, great, well, I have this much to give you, but if you chip in this much, we can do this amazing thing. It discourages that. And that's one of the kind of reasons that you tend to not see artistic collaboration between opera companies in the UK. What you have is very siloed funding and a lot of work that gets development pots and never makes it to a main stage because everyone's like, well, I have it for this, but you can't have it. Well, that's our artists. Well, we developed them. Well, but no one has enough money to do the whole thing. So that's also not perfect. I feel like there's something that, Jasmine, you're kind of nudging at, that everyone is kind of nudging at, which is like, what if we just challenged ourselves to make work that like lots and lots of people wanted to see? You know, like, yeah, right, like crazy idea. So for me, I feel like, and that's something that obviously like the pressure of the market also creates certain types of art. So that's something to consider as we try and ideate out of this. But I will say that I couldn't support my family if I was still working only in Europe. That working in the US has enabled me to earn a living as an artist, and that's really important. I will also say that that the funding model that we have also ensures that to get to the next stage in your career, I feel like there are a lot of mid-career and beyond artists in this room. You have to put in a certain amount of investment, and for example, a lot of women or a lot of people who don't have a support system, like I've heard this again and again in the pandemic, that so many women were pulled out to do full childcare or to backstop family members and care for them or whatever, you know, and weren't being paid for that. They're not able to make art. So a lot of the art that we see in the US, because we don't have universal childcare, because we don't have paternity leave, all of those things, what we are ensuring is that the stories we're hearing are from young single people or single people with no dependents, who are able to only focus on their art. For example, this is a particular bugbear of mine, there is currently no residency in existence, no artist residency in existence that allows you to bring children. Does not exist. I have been on panels about childcare provision for opera companies. And there's been a lot of chat, and then everyone goes, of course, it's very expensive. We just can't do that. I've just moved to Canada. I moved in my final trimester. And in that time, I have worked with 2 very small but mighty companies, and both of them have offered to provide childcare so that I can work for them. So it's possible, but those economics are shaping the work that gets made, the artists that get heard. And isn't it a shame that we are silencing people with complex life experience because of our failure to institutionally provide support for them? And of course, it should be the government. We should have universal paid leave, all of those things. But companies can do it, but they have to just choose to. So that's my spiel. Obviously, this is the top of my mind at the moment for obvious reasons.
Oh, that's an amazing point, Lila. And, as we're starting to talk about funding models and some of the inherent elitism that can be in that traditional model in this field, I kind of want to touch on the EDI work happening in the field, and what your individual experiences have been in that realm. I know the theater industry has been making some really interesting strides lately. They have a slightly different funding model, so it's a little bit of a different ballgame. But as we've been talking about turning this great big battleship for some of these larger companies, especially, the opera industry is starting to follow suit and make some change. And so I want to hear about how this process is evolving from each of your perspectives as artists, administrators, creators, designers. And obviously we know there's a ton of room to grow. So where do you see that room to grow? And what do you feel like, is there anything you feel like opera is doing or could be doing to really progress in that space?
I'll jump in. So I would like to say, because I know this, obviously there's so much more conversation around EDI in terms of programming, BIPOC stories, BIPOC creators, all fantastic and wonderful, diverse casting, which, we shouldn't even be talking about anymore because it should just be normal. The part that I'm really looking forward to having the shift of is that it's not glamorous, but having the conversation about EDI shift to internal practices in terms of diversifying board, diversifying leadership, diversifying staff. What is the internal culture of how people are embracing what's going on inside of a company? And this part I have seen in the various companies that I have been in, both as a singer and administratively, is that it creates so much of the choices that people do not see. The glamorous side of the conversation is on the programming and the stories and the creators, and that's fantastic. What they don't understand is also what's happening behind the scenes dictates and guides those decisions about what kind of stories are coming in to be programmed and created and commissioned. And so that's the part of the conversation I would love to see happen. And those things are happening internally in companies. However, sometimes it's still in the performative stage. Sometimes it's let's tokenize the few people who are here and let's just continue as we normally do behind the scenes. And then sometimes there are companies that are truly in the messy place, the very messy place, and it's extremely painful of actually doing the work, and it's creating situations that are not fun. And we're seeing some of that play out in social media right now, and I'm not going to name anybody. And that's the exciting part, because it's the messy part that's going to get us to the better part. But we've got to get through that stage of where we're actually doing that work, because what it's going to do is it's going to create different funding pathways. It's going to create different decisions about who we hire. It's going to create different decisions about how we market to our audiences and our community. It's going to create different decisions about casting. And there are still some companies out there that are saying EDI, we're so proud of the EDI work we do, and yet internally they're still a mess. So every company and city is in a different place right now in this growth process. And as we all know, birthing is messy and scary and screamy. And I see that happening right now in the opera world in terms of this. So I would love for this to shift right now to let's diversify the board. that's not glamorous or sexy to talk about, but it's going to create so much of a difference in what we're all talking about.
I just want to, oh, Lila, were you about to say something?
I was just about to be like, oh man, because that's what changes forever.
I just wanted to say, yeah, this is really random, but it still ties in, I promise. I'm in a barbershop quartet called Halo, and we have a race program that we call Race and Real Talk. And we talk about race relations in America, and we use the structure of barbershop music to navigate difficult conversations. So it's not just race relations, but any difficult topic as it comes to like redlining or things that also pertain to like intersectionality, what am I saying? And things that affect different demographics across the country. Anyways, one of the things that we say in it is embrace the tension, sing the truth, right? So it's this idea that before we can resolve and actually come to a conclusion of something or real actualized change, we have to sit in some nasty discomfort. Like going back to what you were saying, Priti, like we have to sit in some spaces that people that have internalized something that they weren't even sure that they did, they have to come to terms with that. We all have unconscious bias. We all have things to work on within that. And that ties into how we hire into organizations, how we hire artists to commission. All these things tie into it because it's this space that one thing I definitely have noticed is this space of I'm doing you a favor from organizations. It's like, it's this air of like, because I've invited you here, you should feel you should feel thankful and grateful that I've let you be here. And that feeling is something that, and I can definitely speak for myself, but I know I've had many conversations with other BIPOC artists that have said the same thing, that feeling of I'm not valued without the art that I present. I'm not valued when this art doesn't include a space or face for your company to look good, or look progressive, I should say. And that feeling is like, how long will you feel that way? That the response, like the internal response to that is how long will companies feel that BIPOC artists are valuable or useful to them, before it is something that is like, I don't really care. You know, that feeling is like, oh, I give it 2 more years. Like this is a conversation on a regular basis that I have like all the time with other artists, and not even something I feel exactly all the time, but there are many moments that I do. And when you look at boards, like Priti was saying, when you look at boards and you look at the people making decisions, they don't look like the people they're trying to get onto the stage really quickly. And I just say really quickly because it doesn't feel like a longevity type of thing. The works that are being commissioned for BIPOC artists are rooted in trauma. There's like this trauma porn thing that's going on, where it's like, why can't you just invite a Black artist to create something they want to? Why, like, it doesn't have to be rooted in a tragic or space or a place. Okay, I'm done. But yes, that's all I wanted to say. But yeah, that feeling is like, what it perpetuates within in the genre, I would say. And I say genre all the time because other people view it as so many other things, but I say genre because every art form is valid. That is one thing to get all the way through to opera and to the classical world, that every art form is valid. But every offered thought, every type of art brought to it is valid as well. Whatever artist is coming to the space is valid. And it doesn't mean that it's not good because you personally like by your opinion you don't like it, or by your opinion you don't feel it deserves the same kind of respect or space as something else that you respect. But yeah, that's all.
You know, the one thing I want to say that's in regards to new work that is being produced, that is an optimistic point here, that not just talking about the casting and the board, but the stories we tell, the subjects, you know. And through my work on world premieres, I was so encouraged to see that subjects that are being tackled are subjects that are relevant to EDI. And the operas that come out are just phenomenal. You know, I was lucky enough to design sets for Fellow Travelers. Maybe some of you have heard of that opera. It's about the Lavender Scare in the 50s, and a story of two men falling in love and what that meant in that context, you know, and it's just a fantastic opera that is still touring all over the States. I'm currently designing sets for a world premiere of Castor and Patience at Cincinnati Opera. And it's a story of African-American people living in the South of the United States who are currently battling with land grabs from developers who take this land. It's an actual completely realistic thing that is happening right now that people should absolutely be aware of, that, you know, the big hotels, big resorts come down to these lands where generations of African Americans lived and continue to live. And they develop this land, and then property taxes rise 500%. And these people who have lived there for generations can no longer afford to live there. And so this story is absolutely current and is absolutely relevant, and it's so important to tell it. We open it in Cincinnati Opera this July, so I hope you can come. But this is, you know, this is just something about the subjects that is also very important, of what stories we tell.
Absolutely. And just being conscious of the time, I want to actually give you all a couple of minutes. I don't know if any of you have any questions that you'd like to ask of each other, or points that you'd like to kind of bring up in closing as we are wrapping up here in a couple of minutes.
I did want to speak to that topic just briefly.
Sure, Lila, go ahead.
Well, I guess what I wanted to say was, for me, the question is a great deal to do with what Priti just said, which is that the structural change is what makes it the long-term game. And Jasmine, you were so real when you were like, I'm just fucking terrified all the time that basically it's going to end, that it's not going to be my piece of the diversity pie week anymore this week. And then my life is going to be over, right? Like, I can only speak from my experience, which is that, like, I'm only a visible minority insofar as I'm a woman. So that's very limited, and I'm very conscious of that. But I guess what I would say is that that I would like us to get to a point where we're not treated, like the industry is not treating it like pie, because the project of art is empathy. And that doesn't, and to be clear, I'm not doing the artistic equivalent of All Lives Matter. What I'm saying is that when space is actually seated, when a board looks like the city, when it looks like the people of that place, then those choices are made. It's not the self-selection of that board that is representative creates representative artists, creates representative stories. Everything flows from money and everything flows from power, right? And then we're not in the position as artists of, like, for me, as I'm asking myself, I'm like, do I have to tell every woman's story all the time because there hasn't been a woman who has ever been commissioned by this company before? Like, when I finally get a commission to do X topic, it must somehow encompass every woman's experience ever, right? And then you're like, you know, and you trip yourself up, and you don't feel free to, like, explore or try out, or even try, like, joy or comedy for fun and expand as an artist, which is, like, what is fun and exciting, because there's too much bloody pressure. So I guess I would say that, like, leaning into the structural change, and maybe, like, I don't know. I mean, again, I'm also, the first time I ever stood up and called bullshit on a conversation that was being had by an industry panel about something that I cared about, which at the time was gender representation, I was not invited back the next time. So I'm very loath to be like, let's put another demand on artists to, like, vote with their feet. So, but at the same time, I guess my hope is that the empathy project that many of us are engaged in, and that genuine creative processes and genuine, you can't make good art without trust in the room. The healthiest and the most frightening to talk about, that the uncomfortable place, the most terrifying experiences I've had as an artist and the most worthwhile have been ones where we're actually dealing with the stuff in the room between the creative team. Damien and I have super awkward conversations all the time because we have to. I'm working with a native composer at the moment on a story that is a sacred story to his people. And I really didn't want to take the job because I was like, this shouldn't be me, this should be anyone but me. And the dialogue that we had in the process of feeling like this was a healthy creation, that it was okay, was really valuable. It was exhausting, and it's work. It's just work. And that's why it takes so long for organizations to do it, because there aren't any shortcuts. But I do feel like there are enough people that want it to happen. So that's my hope. I also think the question of what is opera doing that is uniquely progressive, it's like, actually, it doesn't need to be uniquely progressive. Opera isn't a special unicorn. We can just like do the work. We can just do the work that the industries that are ahead of us have already done. We don't have to actually reinvent the wheel. Just show up and do it.
Well, and the one thing I want to say to that is, I mean, honestly, why I always bring, especially now, I always bring it back to drag, why I love drag for a lot of performers. So I'm in Astoria, and every month I host what's known as a mixed cabaret. And it is really there full of tons of opera singers, singers across various genres, who are there to share their art through their interpretation of gender, so on and so forth. And what I love about that is because for a moment, I see them step out of an industry whose goal, especially when it comes to sometimes telling inclusive stories, is trying to solve a kind of moral cognitive dissonance around trauma. That as long as I give you a stage, then I'm able to negotiate what I feel is icky for me. And when they can step out of something that actually has nothing to do with them, that's when that light comes through. And so it actually, I feel like, does take for some performers, and we had a kind of little pre-show moment before where I was saying I want to be like Candide and sort of tend to my own garden, is sometimes you have to tend to your own garden while everyone else figures that shit out, because ultimately them not tending to this collective garden means that you will die in that garden. So with that choice, choose your own form of precarity, but figuring out how to navigate moments where you can step out of a conversation that on one hand has nothing to do with you, but its consequences has everything to do with you. So how do you find your own joy in that?
Thank you all so much for sharing your thoughts on that. I do want to throw it over to Wingspace to ask if there's anything that they'd like to do to wrap us up. I think that's a really poignant way to end our conversation today. So thank you all again so much for sharing all of your thoughts.
I'm going to jump in because I've basically been wanting to jump in this entire time. Oh my gosh. Can I also say that we've had like a little chat, some of us who were kind of helping with this slot. This has been amazing. We've basically been like, can it not end? Do we have to stop this conversation now? Oh yeah, if we're in person, now is when we casually end. And then we all would go to the bar or the pub or wherever we are, and we get drinks and we continued on, and it would get passionate. Then people would start sharing their dream projects. And the dream projects would grow into this and seed into this and seed into this. That's how this all works, right? Because we all seed our passions and our shared interests with fellow artists in these conversations. So although some of us weren't able to fully participate, we were able to listen. So thank you all so much for everything you have said tonight. Going to say also, thank you, Noelle, so much for being such a wonderful moderator. Those questions were just great. Just so, clarity behind them helped us make sure we had such an expansive coverage and also I want to thank so much to the Wingspace Salon committee members. I want to say to Christine Mock, Edward T. Morris, Kate Freer, Adrian Jones, Kate Pitt, who's here tonight, Tanya Oriana, Rodrigo Hernandez Martinez, E.L. Hone, also here tonight, me, as well as to Summer Jack, who's also here and been helping out through this whole thing and reached out to some of you as well and been helping produce us all. We had a little bit of trouble with the Facebook stream, but we will definitely be posting everything from tonight's conversation on Facebook and YouTube, so you can share it broad, you can share it wide, basically plant some more seeds of conversation. And also we're going to keep the Zoom on for just like a couple more minutes. So if we want to kind of wrap up even amongst ourselves, but I think right now, we're actually going to end all the recordings